Hello, everyone. We're waiting for everyone to trickle in. And welcome to our May Convo Collective event. This is our second event, and it's our second of two master classes. As you may know, this first time having masterclass events in a series. So this is the second of the two. And welcome everybody across the globe. We are a volunteering organization, and we volunteer our time to conversational AI and to growth and amplification of conversational AI. And we're just going to go through a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. And next slide, please. Awesome. So thank you so much to all of our organizers. We were made up of a collection of 12 organizers from across the globe. Myself, Emily, Fatima, Meredith, Bishma, Chirag, Ulia, Louisiana, Ali, Tim, Anchor, Marcy. Thank you so much for doing all that you do and making this possible. Without you, we wouldn't be able to maintain what we do. And we appreciate everybody's time here. I want to give a special shout out to all the attendees that have signed up and that are present here with us today, and also that have sent in their questions. We will get to those questions as we go through today's featured talk. And next slide, please. And thank you so much for our 2024 sponsor, VoiceFlow. It's been great working with you so far. We're looking forward to doing many more events together. And please fill out the community form and give us your feedback. You can also sign up for our newsletter if you don't have it yet, and join our Slack channel and LinkedIn group as well. And we could also learn about our upcoming events. If you follow us on Eventbrite, you can as well check out our website to check out some of the conversation design best practices we have up there that you can access anytime. And our agenda today is for the first 10 minutes, it's the intro, and then it will be our featured presentation, followed by the final 10 minutes of questions. And with that in mind, please introduce yourself in the chat, where you're joining us from, the city and country, and what brought you here, why you take interest in this particular topic today. And during our discussion, please leave your questions in the chat, and we will try to answer all of them. And finally, to introduce our topic today, it's ethics, bias, transparency, and privacy in conversational AI by our featured speaker, Adam Emfield, who is at present adjunct professor of HCI at Rochester Institute of Technology, and who's also open to new opportunities. And he is definitely an expert in this field, so any companies would be really lucky to have him. And welcome so much, Adam. Thank you for joining us today. We're looking forward to diving deep into this really interesting and hot topic.
Awesome. Thank you, Olivera. So let me pull up my presentation. We will get right to it here. Okay. Perfect. Here we go. So good morning or evening, depending where you're at, everyone. I'm happy to be back here again. To those who didn't see the other session, it's nice to kind of, I guess, virtually meet you and see what you guys are popping into the chats, where you're from, and everything along those lines. And for this session, we, as Olivera talked about, we'll be going a bit into ethics, privacy, bias, which I left out of this slide, and transparency for conversational designers here. And I wanted to preface this with just a quick note that from the very beginning, I think it's worth commenting that I think all of these things are problems that have not been solved. I think that I have some opinions in here that some of you may well disagree with, because these are things we're still trying to figure out as we go along. So I encourage you as we go to take notes of questions you have, of comments you have, so we can have some discussion. In fact, I was hoping to have a little more than just the 10 minutes. So probably be close to 15 minutes of discussion here. because I think this is some of the stuff that we really need to solve as, well, globally in many cases, but that in the case of conversational design is one that we still have a lot of discussion that needs to be had on this front. So if you saw this, the first talk, you've seen this slide before. I won't go into quite as many details, but we'll touch on it again just to reintroduce myself briefly to anyone who may not have had a chance to see that one as well. So I'm Adam Emfield. I'm greeting you from just outside of Boston in Concord, Massachusetts, coming to you with a background in industrial engineering and human factors predominantly. It's a kind of a mix of psychology and engineering for the most part here. Having previously been at Cerence as the director of user experience there, I'm mostly doing conversational design and research in the transportation space. Previously from Nuance, doing conversational AI, almost everything that they did, and things along those lines. And then, as Olivera mentioned, I actually just wrapped up an adjunct professorship contract at the Rochester Institute of Technology with a focus on HCI, computer interaction research methods. And this lecture actually started as one I put together there. And I think you might see that kind of come through here, that it was initially designed for graduate students to think about this as they get ready to move into the HCI field. Some of them interested in conversational design, some in fashion design, and all other different areas that were kind of interesting here. And I will disclose right up front that by design, generative AI was used for part of this talk for the lecture when it was originally done. I highlight that very clearly. My own transparency here, when that was used, you will know. But it's something that I think is an important part to disclose as we go through with this as well. Okay, so I'm going to give you generative AI's definition of itself for what it is. Then I'm going to introduce some interactive questions before we get into the rest of the topic here, where you'll have a chance to answer some questions before we get going. Not verbally, you'll have a chance to do that online here in a moment. And this, again, is the exact same definition I gave last time if you were there. This should look very familiar to you. But when asked to define itself what generative AI is, ChatGPT, in this case at the time it was 4.0, not 4.0, so version 4, defined itself as generative AI as a form of artificial intelligence that autonomously produces content like text or images by learning from existing examples. Using deep learning and neural networks, it creates unique outputs that mimic the patterns of its training data, finding applications in language generation, image synthesis, and creative content creation. And I wanted to share that again here because, one, you'll notice that it talks a lot about finding patterns to generate output. That's a huge part of what we need to be transparent about, or aware of, at least in transparency, and that it's trained off of data that's out there, something that's important that you'll see as we start talking about bias in particular here as well. So you'll notice that by default, without me asking it to, it did not talk much about the ethics part of it. It did not talk much about transparency. In fact, with multiple rounds of prompt engineering, if you did not specify things like that, it at least did not put those at the front of what it would tell me about itself. And I think, again, that is also important to note from the very beginning here, that generative AI systems are not coming out speaking in a way to assure their users that those are their most important or even important priorities without further prompt. Okay, so let's go to some interactive content here for a moment. I've asked Tim to post in the chat here a link to menti.com and a code for you to enter. Once you go there, you'll see it's code 49311944. I'm going to ask you 3 questions here that'll start popping up in real time as you answer those. And so for this first one, I want you to think pre-November 2022, before the big ChatGPT announcement that made a lot of people who weren't tracking OpenAI suddenly aware of the power of generative AI. And I want you to think that if you can imagine back, whether you want to think about, the Asimov's guidelines, or you want to think about whatever else, however we defined ethics back prior to the big announcement here versus today, here in May 2024, do you think guidelines have become more clear as this opened up the conversation? Do you think it's muddied the waters, or do you think it's kind of about the same? And so as answers start to come in here, so far we've kind of got a split on the less clear or more clear, or no more or less clear. And I'm definitely going to be curious what you think here, because from the literature perspective, there seems to be an answer that at least academics who focus on this are coalescing around. And I'll be curious what our own collective here collectively thinks about this compared to kind of the academic world. Give me just a moment more to do that, and then I'll give my 3 cents, thanks inflation, on this. Okay, so we'll see if more trickle in for this, but right now there's a slight skew towards less clear, 3 out of 5 so far, and the rest we're uncertain about that. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the research on this, but I will tell you that the academic literature on this seems to be that they are less clear. That no matter how many people spent their entire careers thinking about this, people who've sometimes been working this for 40 years trying to come up with frameworks for what does it mean to have ethics in AI, that a lot of the literature now seems to lean towards them being like, well, crap, it's actually a lot more questions even after 40 years we haven't thought about. There's the pace of this here is meaning that we have to consider this in ways we didn't consider before. So I think that there's a skew towards less clear for most people. And I read very, very little stuff that thought things were more clear. So there definitely seems to be some alignment there as well. All right, let's move on to question 2 for you here. So this asks, which of the following best describes how likely you are to share your personal data with a modern generative AI conversational assistant? And so I have on a 5-point scale here, starting on the left, you're far less likely to share data than you were before. By this, I mean before kind of generative AI became the thing, circa 2022, versus much more likely to share. And I want to get into this in a lot more detail as we get going here. But I'll preface this by saying that we did a study in about 2016, 2017 that looked at what people would share with conversational assistants way back then. In this case, it was focused on in the car predominantly, and then some of the contexts around that. And I'm going to be touching on those within the slides here. But I'm definitely curious to see how this continues to come in here, because there's more power with more data. But it's using a lot more data, and what does that mean for you as a user nowadays here? So we've got a nice fun split here, a nice bimodal distribution here, it looks like, where people are split between kind of those middle ones, maybe a little more likely, maybe a little less likely, or no more or less likely, with one person saying that they are less likely, but no one's like, yes, this is so powerful, take all my data, give me all the experiences that come with that. Which I think is also important to note ahead of this conversation as well. All right, one more question for now. This one will be more on the open-ended side, just to be clear for you. I like word clouds in a way here. I'm going to ask you to kind of think about this for a moment. Think about generative AI. Think about what transparency could mean for that. What words come to mind with these? And I'm intentionally leaving this vague. Just those 2 terms, generative AI, transparency. What are the very first things that come to your mind? Drop some words or some sentences in here. And let's see if we kind of land on some things here. And this one I hope is going to be kind of interesting here because as an unstructured question in a sense, or as an open-ended question anyway. I think that we can answer this as the end user, someone who's used generative AI as a user. Think about this as a conversational designer, maybe working with generative AI, thinking about what this means to actually build systems that we hope have transparency, the right level of transparency in them. Potentially as an engineer who is deciding which data is trained into these models, or potentially the system itself, the system persona. And I'm going to come back to all 4 of those briefly here right after this question here. But looking at what we have so far from the 16 responses and counting here, some of the ones that jump out to me right away have to do with, well, honestly, some of the risks here, right? Copyright infringement here, accountability, the risk of things potentially not having that accountability. Maybe we can help provide that for them. Black box, things like that as well, data disclaimer. Muddles, I like this one as well here. And I think especially like muddles sticks out to me a lot just from the context of the idea that, because it's a black box, it may be muddling a lot of this together in a way that doesn't make it necessarily clear how things are being used here. But take note that with the responses we have so far, with the exception of citations and data, that these all seem to be something that each of you have mentioned individually, that a lot of these aren't popping up as big words, meaning that at least in this context, a lot of different thoughts are coming to mind around generative AI and transparency. Okay, so thank you for humoring us all and participating in this for me. Let's pop back to the slides here and keep going from there. So I alluded to this on purpose a moment ago. Whenever we're thinking about these systems, especially in the context of this talk, where we're talking about the making a system behave ethically, having it transparent, considering user privacy, keep in mind that we're going to need to view these all through the lens of 4 different personas here. There's the persona of the developer, the engineer building these models, right? When you think about the bias that's built in, the person that selects that data and is actually building the model that trains off of it, we need to think about what they are, who they are. If we can help provide them the data and the guidelines, we have to understand their persona to know how to interact with them potentially correctly here. You as the designer of these systems, your persona matters too, right? Who is it that we are building these tools for to help people make sure that these conversational assistants are indeed more ethically constructed, that they account for user privacy? You know, do I have tools as a designer at my disposal to help me do better for the end user? Then there's that system persona, right? Was you're crafting that conversational assistant when suddenly you have a lot less control if it's using a generative AI element to it than you did with one where you got to craft every word it said in response, or at least, you know, template that in a way you had a lot of control over here. Suddenly the system persona matters in a way that you can't predict the same way you used to be able to do. And of course, our users persona, the ones that traditionally were the ones we focused most on here, but where we need to think about who's going to be using these systems. What type of transparency do the end users want? What are their concerns about their privacy? What risks are we introducing by not accounting for the biases that we as developers and designers might introduce into the system? So for all of these, I really encourage you to think about, for all of these slides, these points, and in all of your work, think about all 4 of these personas, even if you're not responsible for crafting them all ahead of time. So let's get into then some of these topics here. And again, for these, I'm going to start citing some papers as we go through, give you some things to think about. And some of these things, I'm going to be very clear, there aren't solid answers to. These are not solved problems. I'll tell you where some of the discussion is, and I hope we have more discussion here on this. And you know, full disclosure, there's not a ton of answers that I'm going to give you on these because we're still figuring this out. I'll give you some thoughts and some guidance from what I've seen and what I think, but hope we can have some good discussion as well at the end. Okay, so let's get into the ethics first here. I think one of the biggest things you'll see going on in the discourse right now in generative AI, and you see this in popular literature, you'll see this, or popular like media, you'll see this on LinkedIn and discussions, on blog posts, are how do we balance innovation with ethics? And I know this is nothing new. If you look at any new disruptive technology, this is always a discussion here. But you know, we're reaching certain thresholds of the capabilities of these technologies that people have cautioned about and been excited about for, you know, nearly a century in some cases here. And here we're suddenly at a point where the systems themselves can help us bring innovation forward in ways that we couldn't have even imagined a few years ago here. And this balance is definitely something that's really hard. And I think the OpenAI, you know, being the predominant one here, is where you see a lot of this discourse going on, where the whole origin of OpenAI, the intent was for it to be open, for it to make sure people knew what was going in, and that everyone could have some control over it to try to prevent it from growing more quickly. And a lot of the consensus is that it's moved away from that. And that's been a lot of what some of their competitors have brought up, is that, you know, no, we're not going to rush headstrong into this as fast as OpenAI has been. We want to actually take a step back and think about ethics first. And I think we're really going to see that have some interesting implications here, especially because I personally still believe that these organizations are still going to define their own ethical guidelines more rapidly, or lack thereof, than governmental agencies are. Consortiums, industry consortiums, I think are going to be trying to get them done more quickly too. And even with some progress in the EU on this front, and some in the US, I still think we're going to see a lot of this is still being decided ad hoc as we go along here. So I want to talk, though, about one particular point here and then touch on some of the literature for some papers you can look into here if you're interested as well here. And this is that, like any model that's trained off of data, garbage in, garbage out. And I know some of this came up when we talked about enterprise models, when some questions came up at the end of the first part of my talk on tools, teammates, or person as AI goes. But inherently, if you're training on crap data, you're going to get crap results out here. And generative AI, for the most part, when we think about things like ChatGPT, is definitely trained off of a broad set of data we have very little control over. We don't get to control everything that is on the web, and it's being scraped and thrown into that. But if we're working in enterprise scenarios where we have our own kind of garden-walled approach, where we can have some control of that data, we still have to be mindful, even more so than maybe, that any garbage that we put into it will result in garbage out. And remember that we always want to make sure that we are having a representative set of data that represents the types of things that we're expected to be able to do. So if we're building a system, my go-to examples are usually going to be transportation related. But if I'm building my own AI model here that assumes users are going to be asking about things that happen in the car, I want to make sure that the data I get is a good representation of the use cases that might be asked in the car. And I want to include edge cases for sure, but I want to make sure that those are weighted appropriately and that the data that comes in is for that. And I have to try my best to make sure that, to limit this bias here, that I'm going to be trying to think about the future, what information is going to be coming in the future too, so I can build it in ahead of time, and that I'm updating my models in real time to try to get it in there here. And this gets really, really tricky. This gets, well, in some ways, I'd say impossible to get just right. There's tooling things that have to happen in place that help us try to mitigate some of these issues here. But it's something that I think is still a big problem we have to try to figure out here. And so the two papers I list here are a little bit older. These are all ones that came before the biggest, latest stuff with ChatGPT and Gemini and Llama and things like that. But I felt were worth citing here because they give you some insight into some of the frustrations that people were having before this time that I don't think are solved here. The first one, the Global Landscape of AI Ethic Guidelines, tries to break down what these pillars of ethics in AI, at the time they weren't just referring to generative AI, but AI in general, what are the 5 pillars that we can break things down into in order to think about a framework for how to have these discussions to decide how to make AI ethical. And these are, let's see if I remember off the top of my head without my notes in front of me. These are to have justice in the systems, to make sure that they are accounting for everyone, to have non-maleficence, to make sure your systems are not indeed malicious or doing things that are harmful, to make sure that these are fair, to make sure these are transparent, and to make sure that they account for the privacy concerns of users. I believe I got all 5 there, and I believe I got them all right for that. But it's interesting because for some of the things I've already brought up, things that came up earlier, you'll notice that that was kind of the consensus in 2019, that we had to think about that as what meant ethics. Make sure these systems were not introducing harm, that they were fair to everyone, that they accounted for privacy, and that people had some level of transparency for what was going on here. And the second paper is an interesting one because it's a bit older than the first one. This one was in 2016. And this one talks about actually how AI is used to just, at the time, to spit out repetitive task articles for things like quarterly financials from companies, right? So if you've ever looked at the report of the financials from a company, big or small, whether you're talking Alphabet or Microsoft or smaller ones, Medtronic, I don't know, you can come up with any company you want. You'll notice that their quarterly reports, aside from like the statements from the CEO and CFO, tend to be the exact same format. You can tell those are generated automatically. And in fact, more recently, this paper has been cited in some things that look at some news organizations that are using AI to generate a lot of articles. And this has gotten a lot more attention as well about how there's ethical concerns there for a number of different reasons that I won't go into for the sake of this conversation in full detail. But that this conversation has been going for a long time, and since this first paper, it's been 8 years. where one of the things that this paper highlights is when it comes to the mundane, the things that we do repetitively again and again and again. This paper argues that we're not actually fully taking into account all of these concerns around ethics for even the most mundane of tasks, even the ones where we simply plug in the numbers from a company's quarterly financials, where we're plugging in the facts of what happened in town where the police were investigating an incident. Even for those things that happen, dozens or hundreds of times a day, ethics were never a part of the conversation as the first most important thing back then, or rarely. And nowadays, I'd argue this has gotten worse. So something worth considering for this one as well. Now, let's talk for a second here about bias and fairness in this. And I'm going to give some more specific examples in a moment here. I think this is one thing that's become a bigger part of the discourse. I do think there's been improvement here about where the sources of bias are coming in data that are getting trained into these models here, right? And these are ones that for a while, some of the earliest conversations rightly pointed out that some of the biases in these models were skewed towards things such as white men when it came to generating images and giving like the idea of what a user might be, because there was more data on white men from, in particular, North America in those data sets. And I think that was an early discussion you would see in systems from training models on emotive AI to conversational assistants to whatever else it may be as well. But I think now as we're talking more about applications at the enterprise level, where you're able to build your own AIs, we're starting to see that biases are creeping in here that have to do with our own biases that come from our own organizations. Right. It's not hard to be in a company where you think what you do is the best collectively, right? That doesn't mean that you may not be critical of what's going on, but if you are at a company that's doing conversational assistance for finance specifically, right, you're inherently, you want a culture in the company where you believe in your product. And that's going to make its way into any data that you put together that is then trained in an enterprise model. And we're starting to see that not just in enterprise situations, but when people are starting to train their own models for whatever it may be, for academic institutions, for things at home, that we have a habit as humans, we like to kind of fit in our own echo chambers. And it means that the data that's most accessible to us is ones that fits our own current worldview. And it actually creates this kind of recursive loop here where there's a potential really big problem here, where as the data sets start to get smaller in this case for smaller applications, even though they're bigger than what we used to use, we start training it on data and then generating output from AI that will later then make its way back into the data and the AI might use to crunch for its latest updates. And what we start doing is feeding our own opinions, our own bias in there and start looping it to a way that we actually kind of funnel down with later models sometimes if we're not paying attention to this and reintroduce our bias again, again, and again, which becomes an issue here. And that truly breaks down our ability to be fair. It breaks down our ability to adapt to the different users that we have to account for and to adapt to the times, right? Using data inherently for this is older data, and it gives us the inability to become representative of a snapshot in time that might be for 2024, 2025, for March of this year, whatever it may be, right? And the way we're getting around this as an industry largely has to do with trying to improve our tooling. And so I won't go into this much for the engineers who are building these systems, but from our perspective as conversational designers, I would actually argue that there's not a lot of great tooling out there yet that helps us detect the bias that we might be introducing for these systems already. I think this largely, again, going back to something I referred to a couple of weeks ago, us having to do QA on our own manually, us having to look at the output of these systems and go, okay, wait a minute, is that right? Is that truly representative? For those of us who do user testing, looking at this, like, wait a minute, are we actually doing this appropriately to make sure that what's coming out is correct here? And I think this is one of the biggest ways that we're going to be able to combat this lack of diversity and bias and to increase the fairness in these models is by putting those tools in place here as well. All right, so then I want to touch a little bit here about the way we're thinking about this stuff. It's interesting because as humans, when we talk about the world, we normally think vision first. And that in of itself has its own limitations to what we're building amongst humans, for those who can't see, as we think about the world for non-human entities or animals or machines. But we usually think about human or vision first. But when we think about AI, it's actually interesting and maybe both a positive and negative thing for us as designers that we usually think about textual data first. we're used to AI being trained on text. Even when audio comes in, traditionally, we would transcribe that and train our models on that. Yes, there are acoustic models that have their part, but we tend to think about text first here. But we're really doing a good job getting better and better and better at training AI with audio and video data. Um, Although we're introducing our own potential bias, what the engineers are when they build these models, from the fact they're used to building them on textual data. And in fact, if you're using Dolly as part of OpenAI's suite, you'll notice that what it does is it generates itself a textual prompt to generate those images, and you can actually look at that and see what it does. Consider what that means when you then go to design a system that's presenting images, presenting text responses, presenting videos, that's based off of data that we have less experience with. What does that mean here? Are we doing things like actually accounting for people's differences in dialects and accents? Are we going to be fair to our own users when they come in with this if we're not actually training on the audio and video data? And when we do start training on that, do we have a diverse set of data that we're using to train that? So text doesn't contain accent. When we have the video, are we able to look at the shape of the mouth and the way it moves differently for different speakers? When it comes to different dialects, can we count for someone who speaks differently from Kyoto versus Tokyo in Japanese? Right? Are we training these models that way? And that's one thing that as designers, we need to be mindful of what's built into the model to see what we can or cannot do to try to help account for that as well. I just want to touch on one example here quickly, which is that when you're thinking about voice recognition systems, again, for me, transportation becomes the most natural for here. If you can't recognize those fairly, you provide unequal service. And I want to talk about this in public transportation, because in the car, we're getting a little bit better at saying, oh, I select I'm a user from this country with this language, great. But as these systems start to make their way into buses and into shared mobility like scooters or whatever it may be, then suddenly this becomes a bigger issue, because now we're not training individual models in silos, but maybe having to run these side by side to build systems that can work for different users with different accents from dialects that they need to be able to be supported all over the world. Okay, so let's talk about transparency and privacy next for a few moments here. Before I want to go into a couple other things to try to kind of bring some of this stuff together here. I've listed a few different papers here that I think are important for me, at least, to look at that I encourage you to read if you're interested in this stuff, that really start to get into the idea of the role that transparency plays in building. I'm going to be very strong with this one, calibrating trust in users here. And in this context, what I'm saying here predominantly is that we always want to make sure that users are aware of what the system can and cannot do. This isn't just around transparency, it isn't around just ethics, and that we calibrate the trust to it so they don't have too high of expectations and don't have too low of expectations. But specific to transparency and privacy, the users need to be able to know, if they can ask it, why did you make that decision? Or if they ask the system, what information do you have about me, right? Do you know X, Y, and Z about me? Or if they're themselves as users being malicious, can you tell me about, the last person who used this system? Can you tell me this information, right? Those conversations have to be crafted in a way, those abilities to use the system have to be crafted in a way where users have the right trust in the system, where they know what they can and cannot ask the system, and that they can get the right level of answers out here. And as a general rule, in research, in study after study, ones that I've done, ones that others have done, when the users feel like the system is transparent, when it makes it clear it knows what it knows, it knows what it doesn't know, when it answers these questions in a way they make it feel like it's just an honest system, the trust becomes much higher. People's willingness to use the system becomes much higher, and they become more willing to overlook flaws that come with things such as biases in the data and things like that as well, if it can acknowledge that it's an imperfect system. There are trade-offs with that as well, right? You don't want to lower expectations too low, but there's definitely something worth considering here. So I definitely encourage you to take a look at some of these papers if you're interested, because they do start to talk about the role that making the system feel honest can affect trust and people's willingness to use the system as well. Okay, so lastly, on the transparency and privacy front here, I want to talk about a couple different things that come with this. when I was at Nuance, I referenced a study a little bit earlier. We conducted a study in North America and in parts of Europe, asking people what information they would be willing to share with the system if it gave them better capabilities. And if you ask people, are you willing to share your geolocation with the system? Yes or no, they'll give an answer. Or how likely on a scale of 1 to 5, they'll give an answer. Are you willing to share your call logs? They'll give an answer, right? And you go through this, you ask them data, and you say, okay, great. How much would you trust such a system? You find that generally people, more so in Europe than North America, but there's some differences as well with generational stuff. People generally like, I'm not so sure I want to share that data. If you present them a use case that says, hey, I can do this really, really cool thing for you. But in order to do that, I need to know, when you call your spouse on the way home from work. I need to know how long it typically takes you to get home from work or to drive to the grocery store. I need to know how long you're in there. When you're giving them the value of the use case first, and then you ask for data, they become much more likely to share it. And then there's this interesting layer, this caveat there that I think really touches on this as well. And again, this is all pre-2022. This is back mostly 2016, 2017 timeframe. But then when we ask, now what happens if you know that data is being processed just inside your vehicle, just on your phone, just with your speaker, and it never goes to the cloud? Are you more or less likely to share information? And people say, I'm more likely to share it if it gets used and then it goes away. And then if you go, okay, well, what if it goes to the person who makes the device, right? This means that it just goes to Amazon if you're using Alexa. It just goes to Mercedes if you're using the Mercedes car, whatever that may be. Then their answers are kind of about the same. And then if you go, well, what happens if a third party gets it, right? What happens if someone else gets their hands on it? Willingness goes down. And then if you go, what happens if they're going to use it for marketing? Willingness goes way, way, way down. So I want to talk about that study here because it becomes really interesting because with the black box system, suddenly we have to be really mindfully aware of where that data is going and how it's being used, and know that if users feel like we are being transparent, and back to the last slide and point, they're more likely to share this data that can allow us to craft these more intimate personal experiences for them. But if they're afraid everyone's got access to their data, they're going to become less likely to. And so when we start designing these systems and how people are going to use them, be mindful of that. Think if there's ways we can supplement this, because we're going to have use cases we want to provide our users that become impractical if we can't get our hands on certain data. But we also want to be mindful and honestly assure users that we're taking care of the privacy in the right way. So it's definitely something we're thinking about here. It's going to take a lot of effort. I make the point here that you may be willing to put in a lot of effort to track this down. You may not. Our users may be willing to put in a lot of effort to figure this out. Some may not. There's definitely things we need to be considering here as well. All right, so I've monologued more than I expect on some of these points, but I wanted to touch briefly on 3 case studies, all in the automotive segment, just because these are the ones I've followed most closely, but also ones that have gotten a lot of attention in some cases here. And I encourage you to dig into these deeper if you'd like as well here. But Tesla has always been in the news for their use of AI and autopilot in particular there. And when ChatGPT, in full disclosure, this summary is one I asked ChatGPT to give for me. It talks about the way that Tesla's using AI here as well. And you'll notice, and this is why I wanted to have ChatGPT provide this for me here, is that this tries to give kind of a balanced approach in its own opinion. I didn't give it any prompting for how to word this for me. It talks about how it gives users the ability to opt in or opt out of data collection as per their preferences here. But it naturally does not go into some of the controversies about the data that's been collected and trained on and the imperfections that have then been trained into autopilot. It doesn't touch on a lot of other things here as well. So this means that if I had a user in the car driving a Tesla that was asking, tell me a little bit about Tesla's perspective on the way that they account for privacy in their systems, this might be what they hear without some fine tuning. And you'll see a similar one here for ChatGPT's response for how Mercedes uses it here as well. And you'll know that Mercedes themselves prides themselves in their brand of their own experience here. How it's actually a big step for them to very clearly disclose that it's ChatGPT, as they have a habit of trying to own their whole brand here. And you'll see here again that it's relatively a neutral, skewing positive way. They talk about how people can control their privacy using the app. no additional details given here as well. But they talk about how Mercedes does emphasize transparency and responsible data handling. And if you go read yourself on Mercedes' approach, they are actually very clear that to them, they say this is a priority. And General Motors of the three, I would say, takes the strongest approach, at least that's my opinion here, about how they care about following the laws, how they care about ensuring that they meet and exceed the GDPR requirements in Europe and the requirements through the US and in Germany and in Australia and other places as well. They try to insist that this is being accounted for here. So these are three different answers here when asked about automakers and the way they approach, privacy that ChatGPT gave me that I felt was worth sharing here as well. Okay, so I want to throw two more terms at you here. I'm actually going to skip over some slides here because I want to touch on kind of a special use case in ethics I think is important to touch on here. In statistics, we often talk about reliability and validity. Reliability in that context referring to the ability of a system to give information that is accurate give the information that is consistent time and time again. If I give a similar prompt, if I say the same thing to the system, I should be able to get very similar answers. In a traditional conversational assistant, that was easy. Someone would ask the same prompt 10 times, they would get the same answer as long as things were understood correctly. With generative AI, suddenly those answers might be different. And that makes it really tricky for us to do that. And we should start thinking about what that means ethically if the system provides a different answer every time, right? How are we going to put guardrails around that? Should we put guardrails around that to be able to make sure that it's reliable and it's consistent as it goes over time? For validity, this means that the information that they get is valid, right? Are we not hallucinating? How are we going to help users check if this was a hallucination or not? Are they going to have that ability to make sure that the information they get is valid, and they're going to trust it at the right level? Now, these are tricky things that we have an ethical responsibility. I'd say this is one of the biggest ones out there to make sure that we are providing information that is true, that is valid. And this is that's one of the hardest ones to figure out how to make it kind of self-check itself, because they prioritize sounding natural over being correct a lot of the time. And then introspection, I've talked about this a few times here, haven't fully defined that and should have earlier. This is the ability for us to ask the system, well, wait a minute, why did you make that decision? These are things that are really tricky for any AI system to do, or even tricky for us as humans sometimes, but something that I would say would be one of the best things for us to put in there to help people believe in our systems more, is give them the ability to answer the question, but why? Why did you do that? Why are you recommending this? Are you certain that this is the correct or the best answer? Okay, so I'm going to skip through some of these here. Prompt engineering is something I believe you're all pretty familiar with. Something that I was going to include here originally to touch on briefly about how I wanted to showcase that as conversational designers, we're willing to prompt engineer to get the right answer. But note that most of our users, other than an initial exploratory period, are not willing to. And so it's important for us to provide support for our users to help them learn the right way to say things more than ever with generative AI, just because the floodgates open and the fact that the systems may not always be reliable, may not always provide valid information. It means that our job as conversational designers, we have an ethical responsibility to guide them towards using the system in a way that gets the results that we are happy with and promote things that we think are important. So I want to wrap up with one kind of spotlight here on an ethical responsibility I think is important to us, that I would argue hasn't always gotten the attention it should, even though so many of us in this space have wanted to give it this attention, and that is accessibility. I encourage you to go to this post on LinkedIn at some point and look at this. There's an interesting perspective from Jacob Nielsen. I've never heard him pronounce it, so let's make sure I get it right. But where he talks about how his argument is that we've failed in the kind of UX and UI space to handle accessibility, partially because we have focused on building a GUI and then making it for a sighted user, and then adding a screen reader for users who are maybe blind, as an example here. And you can look at different versions of this for people who are deaf and hard of hearing for conversational assistants as well. And he argues that with the advent in particular of things like large action models, we suddenly have the ability to generate an interface for people that can generate unique interfaces for sighted users and non-sighted users. And it's fair to say that we can then generate an interface for people who are deaf and hard of hearing and people who can hear, within the normal confines of how we define that as well here. And to illustrate one point, and this is where I talked about images to those of you who were listening in earlier here. Here's a fun image I saw that someone had initially put together with Gender of AI with the middle-aged mutant Ninja Turtles. So for those of us who grew up with these in our childhood, I hope this resonates and is making you all smile at least a little bit here. But what I did in my class, in RIT, there's a huge population of deaf and hard of hearing students, and they've got a college dedicated to this. So accessibility is a focus here. I showed them how 3 different users might ask a system to describe the image for them. And so obviously won't read this out here in detail, but if I say, please describe this image for me, bam, here's what you get. And it tries to touch in, a little bit with their physical appearances. It touches that it's playful. It touches that they indeed look middle-aged, and it has some fun stuff there. But if I have someone go a little bit further and say, all right, I'm legally blind. I need you to comment on the style. Potentially this is for an art class I'm doing. I need to understand it. Can you describe it for me? Notice the change in tone here from the system here. And imagine if this is the type of thing that my user is often doing, right? It's someone who's like me, who's more verbose, gives more detail than they absolutely need to have. Just look at the difference in the response here. And obviously, some of this is by design, right? I'm telling it to comment on the artistic style specifically, but those types of things that I might add in, those individual words here, are going to change the response notably here in a way that has huge implications for the users. And we start thinking about accessibility here. If I'm designing a system that's being used by people with these accessible needs and those that are without them, I have to be aware that the experience they get might be very different. And just to give another example here, then I said, well, what if I'm not an English as a first language speaker here? And I give it the same prompt. I need it to be described for me for, the artistic style for an art class or whatnot here. And you can look at this and see that it does some of this well, but it still actually gets into some of the notifications here. It still gets into some of these terms that might be considered a little bit more jargon, where if English wasn't my first language, I might have to ask this again and try to rephrase it again and again and again. And this is one where I'd want to be aware as a conversational designer that if my user base has people with disabilities who may not speak English as a first language, who are then using my system speaking in English because that's all it supports for them, that this might be the type of outcome that they get with. And that I would argue we have a responsibility to do our best to take care of these users as well. So one last example, just for fun with this here. I wanted to imagine that instead of this being something where I had to describe it, I gave it that same image, I uploaded it to DALL-E in this case, and I said that I had a hard time perceiving certain colors and asked it to regenerate it in higher contrast. So I wanted to show 2 things here, the prompt that it gave me, and then the prompt that I gave with the image, and then the prompt gave itself back here as well. So this is something I wanted to show you because it's that feedback loop I was referring to. In this case, I'm just talking about it generating an image the way it normally does. But what happened was I gave it a prompt, and then it created itself a much more widespread prompt that then in the future may well be trained in this model. And so as this starts going, it starts to be recursive. Once again, you can end up with these issues where you have this problem where that becomes a feedback loop as well. But so this makes the 80s and 90s kid in me very happy. I hope some of you can enjoy this example as well. But I also wanted to share this just because I think that now is a better time than ever to talk about how we have an ethical responsibility for accessibility, and one that I wanted to make sure that we covered. So with that, we have some time for questions. I'm hoping we can have some good discussion here, and let's go from there and see what we have. So I was trying to pull up some questions we have here.
Adam, we have a question from Malini. If I pronounced your name correctly. What's the difference between bias and perspective?
That's a wonderful question, and one I will answer, but definitely in of itself, it will be with my own biases there, right? And I think that's a really powerful one to think about for conversational designers here. From a purely kind of academic sense, in this case, when we talk about the bias here, we tend to be talking more about when data is introduced that might provide someone with a misleading answer based on the fact that it's not representative of the information that we want to present to them, or that it may be misrepresenting who they are as a user there. We usually talk about that, of course, in a negative way. But perspective is interesting because I think that kind of implies that, well, we don't necessarily want to average out perspective, that there is some value in providing different perspectives, right? And more so than like different brand experiences, things like that as well. And I think it's going to be a trick, and this is probably one that I don't know that there's a great answer to out there perfectly yet, but one that I think was probably going to vary a little bit by any given application you're working on, where you're going to want it to feel like there is a consistent personality, consistent persona of the system that can provide its own perspective, but without potentially misleading them or withholding information they might otherwise want their hands on. And I think that's kind of goes back to the transparency. And again, this all risks getting too verbose, as I may do myself sometimes. But you want it clear that you're presenting an opinion or a perspective, whereas you don't want the bias to be hidden where they take it as fact, as truth, based off flawed data, and you present it to them in a way that they can't understand its perspective. So I don't know if that's an entirely satisfying answer, and if you have thoughts on this, I'd be happy to hear kind of your perspective on this one as well.
Yeah, if anyone has any thoughts on this, please, most welcome to speak and talk. We're definitely having an open discussion here. Adam, if we could read one of the comments from
Yep.
Spencer, and he has shared a lot more about third-party data being tracked.
You got it. So yeah, Spencer says, one thing to think about with share with the device maker. Intrinsically, all tech is third party. Chips, etc., are made by third parties, and the device maker, Amazon in Alexa's case, put their label on it as a whole. As far as I know, Amazon has some QA before it leaves the factory. My knowledge stops there, though, and there could be other scrutiny from other companies along the manufacturing journey. And I mean, that's a really good point, and that's definitely the case. And this comes back to, again, I talked about calibrating trust, but also calibrating expectations. Um, Users don't and probably don't need to know these details about the fact that they may have a chip from NVIDIA on one part of this, they may have a chip from someone else in another, that this process might be using an engine from Microsoft to turn their audio into text and whatnot. There's definitely a whole bunch of stuff there as well. They want to know that information is available, but like always, they're not going to go necessarily read the manual. We know that very well. I think that it's more a matter of that what users really want isn't as much to make sure that no third party touches it, as much as what they're really asking for is transparency in how their data is going to be used. And they learn to trust Alexa, they learn to trust, or Amazon, they learn to trust Apple, in particular is known for that trust. And if you can present kind of a unified thing, that QA is happening before, that this is an Amazon experience, an Apple experience. And if they can dig up that information, they tend to then they're likely to be more comfortable for that. But there are going to be limits there as well. So it's not as black and white as it made it sound in that study for sure. But kind of having the cohesive experience where they know, look, I'm Apple, I've got your back with privacy, is going to help break down those barriers and give those opportunities, as long as you're being honest and fair with it.
Yeah. Thanks, Adam. That was really insightful. I also had a thought around having, or, like as users, we do create social profiles for our virtual assistants. Like we have profiles on Alexa, we have profiles on any of the other virtual assistants. Like I've seen restaurant virtual assistants creating profiles to take our, preferences on dishes or tastes, and then recommending us the restaurants. So I think all of this is also gathering third-party data.
Yeah. Yeah. And in a lot of those cases, those are ones where I use the term enterprise solutions, but it's kind of similar for kind of the do-it-yourself models in more cases. even if there's tool sets where you're picking the data yourself. That's definitely something that is trained on data. And it's interesting to see, because then you're getting the data it's trained on, right, which is usually a smaller set there, that you then often will augment with like a broader set. You know, if I have my own restaurant and I'm training on my dishes, I may well want it to understand what flavor profiles mean. I may want it to understand differences between people who like spicy food and people who don't, and feed in some data from outside as an example there. And then I might want that to convey the professionalism of my restaurant versus the casualism of this other restaurant or whatnot. And there's definitely some interesting bits of data there, where I'd say the challenge becomes the data we train it on may all automatically have one tone, one kind of personality to it. But as a designer, we want to maybe kind of transpose that into the kind of experience we want to have for them as well. And it can get kind of tricky too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we'll take just one last question, which is from Olivera, and she's asked, can you talk at a high level about the types of biases? I've read there are over 100 types.
Yeah. Oh, man. Yeah. Well, and this is tricky because there's like human style biases, right? The way we talk about biases, like to be a human, but there's also, when you talk about bias, statistical ones, right? Where you, for example, I'll pick on one that we use in statistics, where we talk about, where we choose data sets. It's lost a term for it at the top of my head, but where we choose data sets that in and of themselves reinforce themselves. So if there's a body of literature on something that we're citing, if we just keep citing each other, right, we're using kind of a very narrow bias there. For humans, as an example, there's confirmation bias. We want to find data that confirms what we already believe about the world, and then train it into the model, which is an issue as well. There's biases here when you get into like gambling. We talk about like the gambler's fallacy and things like that. We feel like you should win next time. We start talking about using a system and then using that data to go back and retrain the model. There's a risk of introducing biases by what we expect to come next, where we as humans horribly predict the next outcome. And if we're selecting data or we're using the system in a way to train it off of that, where we have false predictions about what it's going to do next, and that gets trained back into the model, that introduces other biases. This is tricky because there's so many different types of biases. But if you want to go dig into these, look at them both as kind of, we talk about statistical biases that result in improperly trained models, as well as the biases that we have as humans that we can introduce into the systems when we choose the data and when we design them to interact with our users.
Right. Adam, if we could just take one last question from Malini. How are these issues of ethics different, if at all, when dealing with human bots or digital humans?
They definitely are, sorry, in some ways. And let me touch on this a little bit. One of the articles I cited a little bit earlier by Ewart de Visser and some of his colleagues talks about the role of anthropomorphism with virtual assistants. If I make something look humanoid in some fashion, and this can even be like an AI, like an avatar, it doesn't have to be an actual physical robot. But the more I make it look human, the more I'm changing the expectations of my user, right? It was intentional why Siri is a little, circle that moves. There was a decision not to have it be humanoid. I'd say there's an ethical responsibility at a minimum to understand the expectations our users have when they're talking to something that is humanoid versus non-humanoid, that we need to build into the models, because the type of questions and the way they interact is going to be different. And the risks of it presenting different types of information, right? They're more likely to inherently trust the one that's more human-like. If it's likely to introduce harm or false information, that's going to be harder to calibrate for them if it's more humanoid here. So I'll lastly say, humanoid bots versus digital. I think if it is an avatar that looks like a humanoid bot, that's a little bit fuzzier here. There's definitely appears to be less risk of physical harm directly from a digital human versus a physical humanoid robot. But aside from that, I don't know that I have a solid answer as to like if there are ethical responsibilities different between those, specifically if they're both very humanoid and kind of analogs to each other.
That was great. Thank you so much, Adam. It was really insightful session today. Thank you everyone for joining in today with us. And if you have any more questions, please reach out to Adam on LinkedIn. You can connect with him and also reach out for any more questions if you have. And see you all next time. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks all.